You want to learn how to turn your drawings from this into this? Hi, my name is Oyun Orka, a VTuber who tries to draw, and while I don't draw it often, rainy scenes are really fun for me to draw, and not too complicated either. Back when I did this animation, I received some comments asking me on how I animated this, so finally, after over a year, let's talk about how to draw and animate a rainy scene. So here I have my base drawing as well as my initial thumbnail sketch, which I'll use for reference for lighting direction. But how do you know what colors to use? Well, that brings us into the first part of our tutorial, which is how to choose colors. When choosing colors for rainy scenes, since the sky is covered in clouds, typically you'll end up with a less saturated scene. So generally, I try to avoid highly saturated colors as well as extremely harsh lighting. You can use any photos as reference or draw from imagination. For this drawing, since I want to go for a sort of lighter and hazier look, I'm using this photo taken by Balaji Malliswamy as my primary reference. All photos that I'll be using in this video are from Unsplash, and links to all the photographers are in the description down below. So I'll go ahead and paste the photo reference on the side of the canvas, and drag that to the side of the canvas. Next, I'll go ahead and use my Evergreens brush from my nature brush pack, which is linked in the description down below, and draw in some trees. First, I'm drawing in the trees furthest from the viewer, and also choosing a very light color similar to the sky. Next, I'll go ahead and use a light airbrush, and just use that along the top of the canvas. Once I have the base background trees done, I'll go ahead and make a new layer and draw in some trees slightly closer to the viewer using more saturated color. Next, I'll go ahead and alpha lock this layer and use the lighter airbrush just along the top of the trees and a darker airbrush along the bottom of the trees to give it that effect of shadow. Finally, just to add a little bit more texture to the trees, I'll go ahead and make a new layer, alpha lock that to the layer we just made earlier, and draw in some more trees, this time with the darkest color. Next, I'll go ahead and set the tree brush to erase and just erase from that to give it some more texture. For this drawing, since I want the character to be in focus, I'll go ahead and hide the layer with the character on it, merge all to new layer, and then Gaussian blur the entire layer. As a final touch, I'm going to go ahead and use airbrush again and bring out more of the lighter values towards the top of the canvas and darker values towards the bottom, while also just very lightly using a little bit of a light airbrush on the very bottom of the canvas. This is just to give it that bounce light effect. So now that we've finished our background, let's move into shading the character. When choosing colors for the shading, while it's not very realistic, I also sometimes like to add a little bit of shine to the character itself when drawing rainy scenes, and almost treat the character like it's a raindrop. First, for the shading, I'll go ahead and make a new layer, clip that to the character layer, and then color pick a bluish gray from the background layer, and fill that entire layer. Next, since I want this character to look a little bit shiny, kind of like a raindrop, I'll go ahead and add some bounce light beneath the character on the character's chin, along the edges of the hair, and also along the edges of the clothes and jacket. For the bounce light layer, I'm making a new layer, clipping that to the character layer, setting that to screen, and just choosing a very light blue. Next, I'll go ahead and add some shading to the character. I'm making a new layer, setting the color to grayish blue, and setting that to multiply for now. Since the light is primarily coming from the top of the canvas, I try to reflect that in the shadow, and later decide that I actually want to set this multiply layer to linear burn instead. I lower the opacity quite a bit, and like last time, I'll go ahead and select just the skin color, delete the other color areas, and set that so it's a slightly warmer color than the surrounding shadows. Finally, to get a slightly shiny effect on the character, I'm going to go ahead and make a new layer, just set that to normal, and use a very light blue, almost white, to add highlights to the character. I'm primarily adding highlights on the hair, the edges of the character, and slightly on the eye as well. So now that we've finished the background and shading, let's move into talking about how to layer the rain. So before diving straight into drawing the rain, I want to first talk about how I generally break down layers when drawing a rain scene. When drawing rain, I essentially think of three primary rain layers and how far they are from the viewer. Raindrops further from the viewer will appear smaller, and because they're further in a set time span, it'll look like the raindrops travel less far. To convey that, the further the raindrops are, the shorter I'll draw the line, and the closer the raindrops are, the longer and larger I'll draw the lines. So essentially, I'll start with the character base, then add the first smallest layer of the rain. More raindrops will be visible, but each line will be smaller. Depending on the drawing, this can sometimes be combined with the second layer of rain. These will be longer as they're slightly close to the camera, and finally we have layer 3, which is droplets that are really close to the camera. For this layer, instead of using a solid white brush, I typically use a soft round brush to give it that blurry effect of being so close to the viewer it's a little bit out of focus. Now realistically, rain doesn't care about grouping itself into cohesive layers, so the method earlier is essentially just an oversimplification. and also depending on the depth of field, sometimes even when it's raining, you don't see the raindrops clearly. For example, in this photograph, because the focal point is different, you don't really clearly see the raindrops. But for a simple animated rain drawing focused on the character, this method will work here. However, I certainly don't consider myself a professional animator, and if you'd like to learn animation or other skills from industry professionals, check out the sponsor of today's video, Skillshare. Skillshare is the largest online learning community for creatives, with thousands of classes led by industry experts across film, illustration, design, freelance, productivity, and more. Skillshare can help you take your career, skills, hobbies, passions, or side hustles to the next level. Speaking of animation, Skillshare has a great category system for a ton of skills, including animation. So whether it's for 2D animation, 3D animation, motion graphics, or anything else you want to learn, you can find and learn it on Skillshare. Well, in this video, I'll only be covering very minor animation. If you're wanting to learn about how to animate more movement, this course by Siobhan Toomey is an incredible resource. Learn to Animate Classical 2D Animation for Beginners includes a great rundown on simplified versions of the 12 principles of animation, tips for drawing in Adobe Animate, and an explanation on how to use keys, breakdowns, and in-between, as well as so much more. And if you don't use Adobe Animate, you can always use Skillshare to search for how to use a program you already own or want to learn. So if you're interested in learning on Skillshare, the first 500 people to use my link in the description will receive a 1-month free trial of Skillshare. Get started today! So now, let's get into actually animating the rain. So to get started, in Clip Studio Paint, if you want to add animation to a static drawing, you should first go into Timeline and click Add New Timeline. Here I'm just going to adjust the timeline name to Rain Animation, keep the frame rate at 12 from a previous project, and change the playback time to 48, which gives me space for 48 frames. I'll hit OK, and then you'll see the new timeline appear on the bottom of my canvas. Next, once we have the timeline set up, in order to add new animation, you'll need to create a new animation folder. To do that, go under Animation, and then click New Animation Layer, and then Animation Folder. This will create a new empty animation folder, but there won't be any frames under here unless you add them. So in order to add frames, I'll go ahead and click the New Layer button a couple of times until I have about 4 frames for now. You can always add and delete frames in the future. Once you have the frames added in your folder, you can now right-click on the timeline under the row where your animation folder is, and then add the frame numbers. Because this timeline is being played at 12 frames per second, if you leave a gap, then essentially this is going to be playing at 6 frames per second. Now to draw in the rain, you can do it manually or using a brush. I'll show both ways, but for speed, I'll first go ahead and use the brush. Here I'm using the Rain Brush in 1 Minute by Toroku on the Clip Studio Assets store. You can download it using the link in the description down below. So I'll go ahead and use their light rain brush and add in a couple of rain frames. Since I want to test how this will look like on loop, I can change the amount of visible frames on the timeline by clicking and dragging this blue box on the very side and pulling that to the edge of where I want it to repeat from. I'll also make sure that the repeat icon is clicked as well. As I'm animating this, I think maybe it could benefit from 2 more frames, so I go ahead and add a 5th and 6th frame as well, and use the brush to add some rain on those layers. Now that we have our first layer of rain done, I'll go ahead and add the second layer of rain. This time I'll use a slightly longer rain brush from the same brush pack, and draw in the rain using the same steps. However, if you don't have a rain brush, you can also do this manually. Here I'll go ahead and draw in both of the layers of rain on the same layer to keep it simpler for myself. And so this is how it looks like with manually drawn rain. So that was the first and second layer of rain, but what about the up-close layer? Well, to get that effect, I like using a soft round brush, and for this drawing, I'm going to go ahead and use the Bong pen. Link to download will be in the description down below. So essentially when I'm drawing raindrops that are really close to the viewer, I'm just drawing these sort of segmented lines over and over again, and occasionally varying the length. Since I'm also doing 6 frames for this, I'll go ahead and duplicate a previous rain layer, delete all the existing layers, add in new layers, and then it should automatically add that to the timeline. Then, using the Bong pen, I'll go ahead and draw in the raindrops. When I check it and hit play, I realize I may have drawn in too much raindrops, so if you're following along, you can just draw in less or more depending on what look you want to go for. So now, I'm going to go and hide the manually drawn rain layers and go back to the ones drawn using the brush since I feel like they look a little bit neater. Now, like last time, I'll go ahead and use the Bong pen and just draw in some lines here and there, but this time I'll draw in less. Once that's done, I'll hit play and check how it looks. Technically, if you wanted, you could stop here, but let's take it a little bit further and add some raindrops. When drawing raindrops dripping from something, you might notice that the raindrop might stretch a little bit once it breaks from whatever surface it was clinging onto, and then fall generally as a circle. Also, raindrops being transparent essentially act as a round prism of sorts in that they reflect surrounding light. While very pretty, if you're viewing this at a distance and especially drawing this for animation, they don't need to be drawn to this level of detail. So instead, you can simplify raindrops like this. Think of it as drawing C's or O's, adding a dot to a corner, and then optionally adding some shading at the bottom. So back to our drawing, I'm going to go ahead and add some droplets along any surfaces facing the sky, along the jacket and hair. To make my life easier, I'm not going to be animating every single droplet here, but only some of the ones flowing off of the hair and face. As I'm animating this droplet falling, I essentially want to go through a couple of stages. When drawing the rain on the chin, it's a little bit hard to explain with just words, so I'm also going to go ahead and pull the frame out on a separate canvas and explain it visually. So essentially, I start the GIF off with the rain kind of collecting on the corner, and it progressively gets larger until a drop starts to form and then separate from the main area. While this is separating, because this is a looping GIF, I also want to draw this line to sort of indicate water is coming into this droplet later, which you can see here, here, and then here until it meets the main drop here, which makes it larger enough to form another droplet here and loop back. There's probably a better way to explain this, but this is the best I can do for now, so if you have questions, feel free to leave them in the comments down below. Back to the drawing, I'll go ahead and draw on the droplet as I described earlier, and then also you'll see that I add in a little darker line here to indicate the reflection of the character onto the water drop. It's not very visible, but slightly adds a little bit of contrast and makes the drop a little bit more visible. I also add in droplets on some other parts of the hair, but they're a little bit smaller. Essentially, I use the same formula of creating a droplet, letting the droplet fall, and then having it pull up again to repeat for a looping GIF. So now that I've finished animating both the droplets and the rain, I feel like the droplets needs a little bit more gaps between the frames, so in order to duplicate frames in Clip Studio Paint, you can do them manually, or you can shift-click all the frames that you need, right-click on the timeline with all your frames, click copy, and then click paste on the timeline again where you want the new frames to go. This way you don't need to manually add a lot of repeating frames back onto the timeline. So now we have the rain animation repeating 3 times, and I'll also be able to repeat the droplets on a different frame. I'll add an extra gap in between some of the first few frames so that it's being animated on 6 frames per second, and when the drop falls, I want it to be a little bit faster, so I put the frames right next to each other so it's falling at 12 frames per second. Now this is what it looks like. And finally, while this is also optional, because I want this character to not look so static, I also want to add in a blink. So let's talk about how to add blinking animation and other effects to finish it up. So because I drew the eye in the character folder layer, and shading is applied above the entire character folder layer, in order to animate the eye, I'm going to go ahead and cut out the eye and just duplicate that, and then also duplicate the multiply layer that's clipped over the character. Next, I'll pull it out of the character folder, hide the existing eye in the main character folder, and then merge that layer together so that the shading is also on the eye layer. This way I can preserve some of the shine on the eye itself. Next, I'll go ahead and make a new animation folder, and drag in that merged eye layer into that folder. For the blinking animation, this is going to be super simple. Essentially, I'm just selecting the top part of the eye along with the shine and the eyelid, and then dragging that down very slightly. This will serve as the second frame in the eye animation layer. Next, I'll draw in the closed eye, and with just 3 frames, we'll be able to create a blinking animation. So now that we've finished the blinking animation, a very last touch that I like to do is merge visible to new layer, click filter, blur, Gaussian blur, and turn the strength up on this layer to a really high amount. Let's do 88. Next, I'll lower the opacity of this layer to about 34%, and this essentially just blurs the entire canvas and gives it a little bit of a hazy effect, perfect for a rainy scene. And with that, we finished our final animation. And that's it. Thank you for watching, and I hope you found this video helpful. If you did, I would appreciate if you give this video a like, and subscribe if you'd like to see more from my channel. I'll see you next time. Bye bye!